History often remembers conquerors by the weapons they carried, the banners they raised, and the empires they broke. Yet sometimes the course of entire civilizations pivots on a single voice, a single woman whose presence in the shadows shifts the balance of power more profoundly than any sword. Picture this paradox. A young girl ripped from her homeland, sold into slavery, stripped of her name and freedom, only to stand years later at the right hand of Hernán Cortés, the man who would bring the mighty Aztec Empire to its knees. Was she a victim, a survivor, or the silent architect of conquest? This story begins not with the clash of armies, but with the quiet resilience of La Malinche, whose choices, forced or deliberate, reshaped the destiny of a continent. At the close of the 15th century, Spain was still tasting the triumph of its Reconquista, the final expulsion of Islamic power from Granada. Ambition and hunger burned in its veins. Across the Atlantic, the voyages of Christopher Columbus had revealed new worlds, glittering with promise, echoing with rumors of gold and kingdoms waiting to be claimed. In Extremadura, a rugged land of poverty and dust, Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 to a family of hidalgos, nobility in name, but not in wealth. His parents dreamed he might become a lawyer, a scholar who could climb the ranks of Spain's newly unified crown. But young Hernan was restless, ill-content with study, drawn instead to the tales of explorers who set sail for fortunes beyond the horizon. His body was slight, but his ambition was vast. He craved not just wealth, but recognition, the immortality that comes from bending history toward one's own will. Meanwhile, far across the ocean, in the verdant lands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, a child was born into a small Nahua noble family. She would one day be remembered as Malintzin, though the Spaniards would twist her name into Marina, and posterity would brand her as La Malinche. Her life began in relative security, a child of status within a local chiefdom. Yet fate shifted cruelly. After the death of her father, her mother remarried, and in order to secure her new son's inheritance, they cast Malintzin aside. The young girl was given away, either sold or betrayed, into the hands of traders who carried her far from her homeland. She passed through Maya-speaking territories, stripped of her heritage, forced into servitude, learning to survive by adapting to tongues not her own. By the time Cortés' fleet cut across the waters of the Yucatan in 1519, she had already lived many lives in one, each one defined by loss and forced resilience. The parallel journeys of Cortés and Malintzin were marked by the same restless forces that defined their age: ambition, survival, and the unrelenting tide of empire. When Cortés first set foot on Cuban soil years earlier, he had proven himself shrewd, daring, and relentless. He became a notary, a soldier, a landowner, but never satisfied with the moderate wealth Cuba offered him. Diego Velázquez, a governor of the island, entrusted him with responsibilities, but suspicion grew as he saw in Cortés the dangerous spark of a man who would not obey orders if they stood in the way of glory. When rumors reached Cuba of lands richer than any Columbus had glimpsed, Velázquez commissioned an expedition. Cortés, assigned to lead it, knew this was his moment. But when Velázquez hesitated, fearing Cortés' ambition, Cortés defied him, sailing anyway, with a fleet of 11 ships, some 600 men, a handful of horses, and a burning desire for conquest. It was in the first stages of this expedition, amid clashes with coastal peoples, that Cortés came into possession of 20 women, given as part of a peace offering after a skirmish. Among them was Malintzin. To most of the Spaniards, she was just another captive, another nameless woman of the New World. Yet very quickly her gift became clear. She understood Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and had learned the Mayan tongue during her years of displacement. With the aid of a Spanish friar who spoke Maya, she became the living chain of words that connected Cortés to the heart of Mexico. Soon her usefulness eclipsed all others. Within months, the friar was no longer needed, for Malintzin herself learned enough Spanish to speak directly to the conquistador she served. It was not only her linguistic skill that set her apart. She possessed a keen awareness of nuance, of unspoken meanings, of the subtle currents beneath political encounters. Cortés, quick to recognize talent, kept her close, She was baptized, renamed Doña Marina, and placed by his side not as a slave, but as something more ambiguous: servant, interpreter, advisor, and eventually companion. For a man whose future depended upon winning allies and navigating the fragile balance of indigenous politics, she became as vital as his steel and gunpowder. The irony of fate is that both Cortés and Marina had been cast off by the worlds into which they were born. He was a minor noble chasing recognition in a crowded empire, risking death and disgrace for a chance at greatness. She was a discarded child, abandoned by her family, reshaped by captivity, forced to survive by adopting the voices of others. Now in this strange crucible of conquest, their lives intersected. Together they would walk into Tenochtitlán, the gleaming city of canals and temples, and together they would witness its fall. But in these first days of their partnership, neither could yet imagine how deeply their bond would carve itself into the foundations of a new world. Cortés's men marched inland, encountering resistance, forging uneasy alliances. In every negotiation, Marina's voice carried his demands, her words reinterpreting Spanish intentions into terms that local chiefs could grasp. Yet her role was not passive. She often softened brutality into diplomacy, turned threats into bargains, and steered Cortés toward understanding the fractures within the Aztec dominion. The Tlaxcalans, long oppressed by Aztec tribute demands, became crucial allies, not merely because of Cortés's military prowess, but because Marina persuaded them that the Spaniards were not simply another set of invaders, but a chance to break free from their overlords. As the army advanced, Cortés made a decision that stunned even his men. To eliminate the possibility of retreat, he scuttled his ships, leaving no path back to Cuba. The men whispered in fear, but Marina would have understood the logic more than anyone. Both she and Cortés had been severed from their pasts, cast adrift with no return. Their only path was forward, into the heart of empire. It was this radical severing that bound them together in a way no ceremony could. Neither belonged to the world they left behind, and both were inexorably tied to the uncertain conquest ahead. The image of Marina walking beside Cortés, clad in simple garments, translating words that altered destinies, became emblematic of the paradox of conquest. She was both subject and agent, oppressed yet powerful, the channel through which two civilizations confronted each other. Her presence at his side unsettled many of the Spaniards, who viewed her with suspicion, while the native peoples saw in her either a betrayer or a savior. She bore the weight of identities imposed upon her, yet in her silence and eloquence alike, she shaped outcomes no soldier's blade could achieve. By the time they approached the Valley of Mexico, the legend of Cortés's force had spread like wildfire. Rumors painted the Spaniards as gods, their horses as monstrous beasts, their iron weapons as enchanted. But beneath the spectacle lay the steady influence of Marina, whose translations of Spanish ambition into native fears and hopes prepared the ground for what was to come. When Moctezuma, ruler of the Aztecs, debated whether these strangers were divine or human, it was Marina's voice that carried the weight of prophecy and threat into his ears. And so, history bent toward its fateful collision. Cortés, the ambitious hidalgo from Spain, and Marina, the discarded child of Mexico, had become unlikely partners in a story that would transform a continent. The night was still heavy with uncertainty, the path ahead strewn with peril, but already the foundations of an empire trembled, not under the swords of 600 Spaniards, but under the words of a woman who had lost her world and now stood poised to remake it. The hunger that drove Cortés was not merely for wealth, but for permanence. He lived in an age where the sons of Spain measured themselves against legends carved in granite and parchment. To be forgotten was worse than death. To etch one's name across oceans was to defeat time itself. In Hispaniola and Cuba, he had tasted fragments of authority: land, slaves, a notary's pen, scratching decrees in the humid air. But he knew these were crumbs. Greater banquets awaited across the sea, in a land where rumors spoke of golden temples and rulers draped in jewels. Every decision he made in 1519 was colored by this vision. It was why he broke with Velázquez, why he courted mutiny among his own men, why he gambled his life on a venture so precarious that most rational minds would have abandoned it. Cortés was not rational in the way ordinary men were. He was driven by a fever that saw obstacles only as the raw material of triumph. Marina, by contrast, had no ambition for glory. Her ambitions were survival, dignity, and perhaps, though it was rarely allowed to flicker into full thought, influence over her own fate. She had grown used to the shifting sands of identity. Nahua daughter, betrayed child, Maya-speaking slave, interpreter caught between tongues. Each role demanded erasure of the self and reinvention as something pliant enough to endure. Yet when she found herself at Cortés' side, something different emerged. For the first time, her survival was not tied only to submission, but to agency. She could guide events, not just be swept along by them. She had become the indispensable bridge between worlds, and with that came a strange and dangerous form of power. The first great test of that power came at the Battle of Centla, where the Tabascans rose to challenge the Spaniards. Cortés' horses thundered across the battlefield, his iron and gunpowder carving terror into warriors who had never faced such things. The victory was decisive, and in its aftermath, the defeated leaders offered gifts, among them the 20 women who would serve the Spaniards. Marina was part of this tribute, a piece of property passed from hand to hand. Yet even in this exchange, destiny stirred. Unlike the others, she held the key to communication, and soon she was elevated from the anonymity of slavery to the dangerous visibility of influence. Cortés, never blind to advantage, recognized it at once. He placed her near him, listened when she spoke, tested her knowledge of the political landscape. Each successful negotiation reinforced her place. She was no longer just a captive. She was the voice of the conquest. Her baptism sealed this transformation. Clothed in white, sprinkled with water, she was reborn in Spanish eyes as Doña Marina. But baptism could not erase the old names. To her people, she remained Malintzin, a name later twisted into Malinche, heavy with accusations of betrayal. In that moment, however, she was simply a young woman, straddling two worlds, carrying the burden of translation in both language and loyalty. As the expedition moved along the coast and inland, Marina's role deepened. She stood at Cortés' side when emissaries of Moctezuma arrived, laden with gifts meant to awe the strangers into retreat. Gold masks, feathered cloaks, ornaments of jade and obsidian, all shimmering symbols of wealth and divine authority, were laid before the Spaniards. Instead of deterring Cortés, they fanned his hunger. He saw in the gifts not appeasement, but proof of the riches that lay in Tenochtitlán. And it was Marina who conveyed his words back to the emissaries, words that were sharp and ambitious, cloaked in diplomacy yet bristling with intent. She delivered not just sentences but strategies, shaping tones so that Cortés appeared more imposing, more inevitable than he truly was. In those moments, she was both voice and mask, giving form to conquest. Among the Spaniards, some muttered uneasily about the power she wielded. To them, she was still a woman of the land they sought to dominate, and they mistrusted her proximity to their commander. But Cortés silenced dissent with the blunt force of necessity. Without Marina, their words would die unheard, their demands lost in confusion. Her presence at his side was not negotiable. She was as much a weapon as the steel they carried, though infinitely subtler and in some ways far deadlier. The march inland was a crucible. The tropical heat pressed down, supplies dwindled, and resistance flared. Yet every trial also revealed fractures in the Aztec Empire's dominion. The Totonacs, weary of tribute and sacrifice demanded by Tenochtitlan, saw in the Spaniards an opportunity. Marina's voice carried Cortés' promises of liberation, though she herself knew too well that these promises were double-edged. For some tribes, siding with the strangers was an act of desperation. For Cortés, it was the scaffolding of his campaign. Marina, translating hope into allegiance, brokered these fragile ties. Her words drew new allies into the Spanish ranks, swelling their force far beyond what 600 men alone could achieve. It was during this time that Cortés made the decision that would define him in the eyes of his men in the world. He ordered the ships destroyed. Some said he burned them, others that he scuttled them, but the symbolism was the same. There would be no retreat, no return to Cuba, no way back to safety. They must move forward or perish. The men, shocked and fearful, whispered curses, but they also recognized the brilliance of the gesture. Their commander had bound them to destiny by cutting off escape. Marina, though not consulted, understood more deeply than any of them what this meant. Just as Cortés had severed the cord that tied his army to the Old World, so too had she been severed from her past. Neither could turn back. Both were committed to an uncertain path that demanded transformation or death. In that shared severing lay the strange bond that history would remember, even as it condemned. Cortés, driven by ambition, and Marina, driven by survival, had become inseparable forces. Together they would step into the Valley of Mexico, where a city of stone and water awaited them, more magnificent than anything the Spaniards had imagined. Together they would set in motion the collapse of an empire and the birth of something new, born from conquest and compromise, from violence and translation. As the dust of the coast faded behind them, as the mountain passes opened into vistas of fertile valleys and distant lakes, the expedition marched toward a destiny neither fully comprehended. The Spaniards saw only treasure and conquest. The native allies saw revenge and freedom. Cortés saw glory. Marina saw all of these, and something more, a future where her voice, her choices, her very existence would echo longer than the clamor of swords. For in the great collision of worlds that was to come, it was not only armies that mattered, it was words, carried on the tongue of a woman who had been discarded and forgotten, who now stood at the threshold of history. The ships were gone. The bridges back to old lives were ash. Ahead lay empire and ruin and the making of legends. And at the center of it all was La Malinche, the woman who would change an empire. The march inland was less an expedition than a pilgrimage into the unknown. Each step carried Hernán Cortés and his men deeper into a land where every tree seemed alive with whispers, where every village held the possibility of ambush or alliance, where each day tested the limits of courage and endurance. The Spaniards came clad in steel and bearing muskets, but the true weight of their advance was carried in fear, for they knew they were surrounded by countless peoples who outnumbered them 100-1. Yet Cortés pressed forward with a confidence that seemed unshakable, as though destiny itself marched at his side. And at his side indeed was Marina, her presence growing not only as interpreter, but as the very pulse through which conquest breathed. The first alliances came cautiously. The Totonacs, weary of Aztec demands for tribute and sacrifice, saw in Cortés an opportunity to resist their oppressors. Marina's words shaped their decisions, turning Spanish intent into promises of liberation. She translated not only language but vision, weaving images of freedom from the Aztec yoke, while subtly amplifying the Spaniards' aura of inevitability. For these chiefs, Marina's voice was the sound of change. For Cortés, she was more than translator. She was his credibility in a land where misunderstanding could mean death. Without her, his steel might frighten, but it would not persuade. With her, entire towns bent toward alliance. But alliances brought obligations, and obligations drew Cortés ever further into conflict. His small band, supported by Totonac warriors, grew into a moving coalition. The Spaniards were astonished at the numbers swelling their ranks, yet Cortés knew it was still a fragile edifice. At the heart of Mexico lay Tenochtitlán, a city whose power dwarfed that of any single tribe. To reach it, he would need to navigate both politics and battlefields. Here Marina's role deepened, for she not only translated words but explained the unspoken web of loyalties, rivalries, and fears that defined the Aztec dominion. Each night by the campfires, Cortés listened as she unraveled for him the hidden architecture of empire. She spoke of tributary states crushed under demands of human lives for sacrifice, of warriors compelled to march at Aztec command, of resentment simmering beneath outward submission. Through her, Cortés glimpsed the fractures he would later split apart with calculated force. The road brought them to Tlaxcala, a formidable enemy of the Aztecs who saw in the Spaniards both threat and possibility. The Tlaxcalans were fierce, their warriors disciplined, their hatred of the Mexica deep. Yet at first they did not see the Spaniards as potential allies but as intruders. The clash was brutal, days of battle that tested the Spaniards to the edge of destruction. Horses charged into ranks of spearmen, muskets thundered smoke into the air, but still the Tlaxcalan warriors pressed in overwhelming numbers. Cortés fought with the desperation of a man whose fate hung by a thread, while Marina moved among the captured and wounded, gleaning fragments of words and relaying messages of surrender. It was here that her influence proved decisive. She convinced captured warriors and chiefs that the Spaniards were not another Aztec vassal force, but something altogether different. She articulated the opportunity. By joining Cortés, the Tlaxcalans might at last overthrow the empire that had enslaved them for generations. Slowly, through negotiations, gifts, and threats woven into careful phrases, a new alliance emerged. The Tlaxcalans laid down their arms, and soon their warriors marched beside the Spaniards. Cortés gained not only numbers, but legitimacy. His ragged band of invaders was becoming an army of liberation in the eyes of many, though Marina understood more clearly than any that liberation was a mask. The Spaniards sought not freedom for the natives, but dominance. Yet in that moment, the illusion was enough to bind the coalition together. For Marina, the Tlaxcalan alliance marked a turning point in her own identity. No longer just an interpreter, she had become a strategist. She understood that her words could make allies or enemies, could spare lives or condemn them. Every sentence she translated was a choice, and though she appeared to carry out Cortés' will, she often shaped his meaning subtly, tempering brutality into persuasion. Among the Tlaxcalans, she began to command respect, not only as Cortés' companion, but as a figure in her own right. To them, she was a woman who had crossed boundaries and emerged powerful, a symbol that even in chains, a voice could carry the weight of destiny. Cortés, ever aware of the importance of appearances, elevated her visibly. She rode near him, her presence signaling trust and partnership. Whispers among the Spaniards grew louder, but he ignored them. In his mind, power demanded pragmatism, and Marina was power incarnate. Without her, he would be blind and deaf in this land. With her, he could weave alliances into an empire. As they advanced, emissaries from Moctezuma reached the camp once again. This time the gifts were even more magnificent. Golden discs the size of shields, intricately feathered headdresses, ornaments meant to dazzle and dissuade. The message was clear: admiration and fear mingled with a plea to stay away. Marina translated the emissaries' words, but she could not help noticing the strain in their voices, the unease etched on their faces. Moctezuma, emperor of a realm vast and disciplined, was shaken. His priests debated whether these men were gods or devils, whether Cortés was Quetzalcoatl returned or a deceiver cloaked in steel. The empire trembled on the edge of indecision. For Cortés, this was confirmation of his power. For Marina, it was a harrowing moment of recognition. She understood the myths, the prophecies, the fears that stirred her people. She saw how Cortés exploited them, how he wielded ambiguity as a weapon sharper than any blade. Each word she carried into Moctezuma's court of messengers was a seed of doubt, a widening crack in the edifice of empire. And yet each translation tore at her own soul, binding her ever further to the destruction of a world she still, in some corner of her heart, called her own. The march toward Cholula brought the tension to its breaking point. The city, vassal to the Aztecs, greeted the Spaniards with ritual courtesy, yet beneath the surface lay conspiracy. Whispers reached Marina of plots to ambush the Spaniards, to trap them in the city's narrow streets and annihilate them with sheer numbers. The information came to her not in open confession, but in fragments of overheard speech, in the nervous shifts of tone, in the cracks of deception only she could recognize. She relayed the warning to Cortés, who struck preemptively. The massacre of Cholula was swift and merciless. Temples burned, thousands slain, the plazas awash with blood. In the aftermath, Marina felt the full weight of her role. By speaking the warning, she had enabled slaughter. By translating, she had become complicit. Yet silence would have meant the deaths of the Spaniards and perhaps her own. There was no path free of guilt, no choice untouched by blood. She carried that knowledge with a quiet resilience, adding it to the invisible ledger of survival that had guided her life. When the smoke of Cholula cleared, the road to Tenochtitlan lay open. The Spaniards, buoyed by Tlaxcalan allies and hardened by victories, now stood on the threshold of the greatest city they had ever seen. The lakes shimmered in the valley, causeways stretching like arms toward an island city whose towers pierced the sky. Cortés beheld it with hunger, Marina with dread and awe. She knew this was not just another stronghold, but the heart of a civilization, the axis of her people's world. To enter it was to step into destiny, one that would consume them all. The army advanced, banners snapping in the wind, steel glinting in the sun, Tlaxcalan warriors chanting war cries beside Spaniards in gleaming helmets. At the center rode Cortés, his ambition blazing, and beside him Marina, her voice prepared to carry words that would open gates and unravel empires. Together they embodied the paradox of conquest, the European conqueror and the indigenous woman who both enabled and endured his rise. The conquest had begun in earnest, not merely as a military campaign, but as a fusion of ambition and translation, of steel and voice, of destruction and creation. The fate of millions now hinged on their alliance. And as the city of Tenochtitlan rose before them, shimmering like a vision of paradise, history tightened its grip. The collision was inevitable. The empire would tremble, and the world would change forever, carried forward on the words of La Malinche and the will of Hernán Cortés. The valley unfolded before them like a revelation. From the mountain passes, the Spaniards gazed down upon a world unlike any they had ever known. A vast lake stretched across the horizon, its surface pierced by islands where pyramids and palaces rose in shimmering majesty. At the heart of it lay Tenochtitlan, a city that seemed to float upon the waters, its causeways like great arms reaching to the shores, its temples towering like sentinels of stone. Even the most hardened soldiers, men who had crossed oceans and fought through jungles, fell into silence at the sight. Nothing in Spain, not Seville with its cathedral, not Toledo with its fortress walls, compared to this miracle of urban grandeur. And for the indigenous allies who marched beside them, this was the axis of their world, the seat of power that had demanded blood and tribute for generations. Cortés rode at the head of the column, his gaze fixed, his ambition swelling. He had heard tales, he had received gifts, he had imagined wealth, but the reality of Tenochtitlan exceeded even his fevered expectations. Here was a prize that could elevate him above all rivals, that could make him not merely a governor, but a legend. Yet beneath his awe lay calculation. He knew he walked into the heart of an empire with only a handful of Spaniards and a fragile coalition of native allies. Bravery alone would not sustain him. He would need every ounce of cunning, every advantage of fear, every whisper of divinity that cloaked his presence. And central to all of it was Marina, who rode near him, her eyes scanning the land that was both hers and no longer hers. For Marina, the approach to Tenochtitlan was not just awe, but dread. She understood what this city represented. It was the jewel of her people, the nexus of culture and belief, the stage where gods were fed with blood and empires reinforced by ritual. It was also the place where her own fate would crystallize. She, the daughter once discarded, now returned not as citizen, but as the voice of strangers who threatened to unmake it all. Each step of the march weighed upon her with the knowledge that her words would open gates, that her translations would shape the emperor's decisions, that her very presence might tilt the destiny of millions. As they descended into the valley, emissaries met them again, bearing gifts more sumptuous than before. Moctezuma's strategy had been to overwhelm, to awe, to bury the strangers in gold so that their hunger might be sated without bloodshed. But gold, to Cortés, was not an offering to accept, but a promise to seize. He took the gifts, displayed them before his men, used them as evidence that fortune favored their cause. Marina translated the formal words of welcome, but in her heart she heard the desperation beneath them. Moctezuma sought to contain this storm with rituals of diplomacy, yet he underestimated the hunger that drove the Spaniard at her side. When at last they approached the causeway leading into the city, Moctezuma himself came to meet them. He was borne on a litter, draped in fine cottons, adorned with jade and gold, his presence radiating majesty and restraint. Around him nobles attended, their eyes wary, their bodies taut with the tension of the moment. The Spaniards beheld him with curiosity and suspicion, seeing in him both monarch and obstacle. Cortés dismounted, moving forward with a composure that belied the thrill coursing through him. Marina followed, every nerve alive. aware that this meeting was a theater of immeasurable consequence. The exchange between Cortes and Moctezuma was more than words. It was a clash of worlds. Cortes spoke of friendship, of distant kings, of alliances blessed by heaven. Marina rendered his meaning into Nahuatl, shaping sentences that balanced courtesy with authority. Moctezuma replied with ritual deference, cloaking his uncertainty in the language of prophecy and hospitality. Marina carried his words back into Spanish, careful to preserve dignity while conveying hesitation. Every phrase was a negotiation, every syllable a calculation. It was as if the fate of an empire balanced on her tongue, the bridge across which misunderstanding could ignite war or extend fragile peace. Moctezuma invited them into the city, and so began one of history's most surreal processions. The Spaniards, a band of weary adventurers, marched across the causeways into a metropolis that dwarfed anything they had ever known. The markets bustled with tens of thousands. The canals swarmed with canoes. The temples soared above plazas where rituals unfolded in rhythms older than their homeland. They entered the emperor's palace, housed in quarters of splendor, attended by servants, feasting on delicacies unfamiliar and intoxicating. To them it seemed they had stepped into a dream of abundance. To Marina it was a dream steeped in peril. For within the walls of Tenochtitlan, they were guests, but also captives in all but name. Cortés understood this as well. Hospitality could quickly become imprisonment if he allowed Moctezuma to control the terms. And so, with a boldness that startled even his own men, he acted. He placed Moctezuma under house arrest, seizing the emperor within his own palace. The audacity was staggering. An emperor who ruled millions was reduced to a hostage under the guard of a few hundred foreigners. Yet it succeeded, for the Aztec nobility hesitated, paralyzed by uncertainty, unwilling to shatter the fragile balance. Marina once more became the medium of this transformation. She conveyed Cortés's demands, his assurances that Moctezuma would remain honored, his threats veiled in courtesy. She watched as the emperor complied, his dignity intact, yet his authority eroded. She knew she was speaking the unraveling of her own civilization, word by word, a slow dismemberment of power carried out not by swords but by language. The paradox haunted her. She was both instrument and witness, participant and victim. Life within the palace grew strange. Cortés held Moctezuma close, using him as a shield against rebellion, commanding the empire through his captive voice. Marina attended councils, translated decrees, navigated the tensions between Spaniards and Aztec nobles. She became confidant to Cortés, companion in his most delicate maneuvers, and at times his only assurance that he was not utterly isolated in this alien world. For the Spaniards, her presence became habitual, her role unquestioned. For the Aztecs, she was both feared and despised, the woman who spoke for their oppressors, the traitor whose words turned chains invisible. Yet Marina herself was not immune to doubt. At night, amid the flickering of torches, she would recall the girl she had been, the language of lullabies lost to her, the faces of family who had discarded her. Now she moved among emperors and conquistadors, wielding influence greater than she had ever dreamed. But power came wrapped in guilt, in blood, in the knowledge that she had no return. She had been unmoored from her people, and though she walked among them in the streets of Tenochtitlan, she was no longer one of them. She belonged to the silence between languages, to the ambiguity that both bound and divided worlds. As weeks stretched into months, tension thickened. The Spaniards' presence strained the city. Their hunger for gold grew insatiable. Their disregard for rituals and gods became intolerable. Priests fumed, warriors muttered. The populace seethed. Moctezuma, trapped between submission and resistance, withered in dignity. Cortés, ever restless, sensed both opportunity and peril. Marina, caught in the middle, translated words laced with anger, negotiations charged with threat. She could feel the fragile fabric of peace fraying, each day drawing them closer to rupture. And then news reached Cortés of a rival Spanish force landing on the coast, sent by Velázquez to bring him to heel. Suddenly, the delicate balance within Tenochtitlan teetered on collapse. Cortés resolved to march out and face this rival, leaving behind a garrison to hold the city. Marina remained, the voice through which authority would be maintained in his absence. For the first time, She felt the full weight of command without Cortés's shadow. She was no longer only interpreter but the linchpin of survival, the woman who held hostage an empire's emperor, and the trust of a foreign army. The encounter with Moctezuma had transformed everything. Cortés had entered Tenochtitlan as a guest and made himself its master. Marina had entered as a translator and become the thread by which the Spaniards' control was sewn. The empire still stood, its temples still towered, its markets still bustled, but beneath the surface power had shifted. And in the silence of the palace, where Moctezuma sat diminished and Spaniards whispered of treasure, Marina understood that the storm was gathering. The collision of faith, power, and survival was inevitable, and when it broke, it would drown them all in fire and blood. In the history of conquest, few images are as arresting as that of Moctezuma, the emperor of millions, confined within his own palace under the guard of men who barely numbered 600. The king of Tenochtitlan, whose word had once been law, now spoke through the mouth of La Malinche, his decrees filtered, his authority drained. The Spaniards carried themselves as honored guests, but the truth was plain. They were captors, and Moctezuma was their shield. Yet even shields can break, and beneath the surface of ritual and pretense, the city stirred with unease. Cortés believed the strategy brilliant. With Moctezuma as hostage, the vast empire hesitated to act. Nobles and warriors still bowed before their emperor, yet they could not move against the strangers without endangering him. Through Marina's translations, Cortés issued orders in Moctezuma's name, demanding tribute, demanding acceptance, demanding submission cloaked as continuity. Marina, sitting before the emperor in the conquistador, carried words heavy with irony. Each phrase she spoke seemed to cut away another fragment of Moctezuma's majesty, yet she delivered them with calm precision. To falter would be to reveal weakness. To resist would be to invite bloodshed. The Spanish priests pressed their own agenda. They were horrified by the temples of Tenochtitlan, the altars stained with blood, the idols towering above the city. They demanded that the emperor renounce these gods, that crosses be raised in their stead, that Christian truth extinguish what they saw as devil worship. Marina translated their condemnations into the language of her ancestors, each word a blade against beliefs older than memory. She watched as the priests of her people stiffened in outrage, as the emperor strained to maintain composure. Within her, a storm churned. She had grown up with these gods, these rituals. They had been the world of her childhood. Now her voice carried blasphemy into their sanctuaries. It was survival, it was necessity, yet it felt like betrayal carved into her soul. Cortés, ever restless, could not be contained by ceremony. When news reached him that a rival expedition had landed on the coast, led by Pánfilo de Narvaez, dispatched by Velázquez to arrest him, the balance of his fragile empire trembled. Here was a threat not of Aztecs but of Spaniards, men who would strip him of command, undo his triumphs, drag him back to Cuba in chains. He could not allow it. Leaving behind a garrison under Alvarado to hold the palace, Cortés marched with a portion of his men to confront Narvaez. It was a decision born of necessity, but heavy with risk. He entrusted to Marina not only his ongoing negotiations, but the very maintenance of his fragile control in the capital. Marina remained in Tenochtitlan, her presence essential to the tenuous peace. She continued to translate decrees, to mediate between Spaniards and nobles, to soften edges that might spark revolt. Yet she could sense the atmosphere shifting. Without Cortés, the Spaniards grew reckless. They demanded gold with greater arrogance, scorned the rituals they did not understand, provoked resentment with careless disdain. Marina warned them of the growing hostility, but her words carried less weight without Cortés's iron authority. She watched with dread as the tension mounted like storm clouds gathering over the lake. It was during this absence that the great festival of Toxcatl was to be held, a celebration of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. Thousands gathered in the sacred precinct, dancing, singing, honoring their deity. The Spaniards, suspicious of rebellion, watched with unease. Alvarado, fearing that the festival was a cover for uprising, ordered a preemptive strike. Spanish soldiers charged into the unarmed celebrants, slaughtering men, women, and children within the temple grounds. The plaza ran red with blood, the music silenced by screams. Marina was not present at the massacre, but she bore its aftermath. She heard the wails, she saw the fury ignited, she felt the city itself rise in anger. In that moment, the fragile fabric of coexistence was torn beyond repair. When Cortés returned, having defeated Narvaez with cunning and audacity, turning many of his men to his own side, he marched back into a city transformed. No longer awed, no longer hesitant, Tenochtitlan seethed with vengeance. The massacre had broken whatever spell of divinity or inevitability had shielded the Spaniards. Warriors gathered in the streets, barricades rose, food supplies were cut. The waters around the causeways churned with canoes ready for battle. Moctezuma, still held captive, was now despised by his own people. His voice hollow, his authority shattered. Marina found herself in the center of chaos. Once her words had smoothed tension, now they could not bridge the chasm. She translated Cortés's pleas, his justifications, his demands. But they fell on ears deafened by rage. She watched the emperor, once majestic, now diminished, his eyes clouded with despair, his people no longer willing to obey. She had spoken his decrees in the past, but now no decree could halt the tide. She felt the inevitability of collapse pressing in, the sense that history itself had turned against them. And yet, even in this maelstrom, she endured. She walked among Spaniards and Aztecs alike, carrying messages, negotiating with nobles, pleading for sanity. Her resilience was remarkable, her composure unbroken. She was a woman who had been cast aside by fate and yet had risen to stand at the pivot of history. Now she faced the greatest test of all, survival in a city about to explode into war. The gods themselves seemed to stir. Temples loomed, their idols glowering as if insulted by the strangers who had defiled them. Crosses rose beside ancient shrines, symbols of conquest that cut against centuries of faith. The air was thick with incense, smoke, and fury. The Spaniards were trapped in the heart of a metropolis that no longer welcomed them, hemmed in by countless warriors thirsting for retribution. Cortés, brilliant and bold, schemed desperately to hold his ground. Marina, steady and perceptive, sensed the futility. The storm could not be averted, it could only be endured. Moctezuma, the emperor whose name had once resounded across valleys and mountains, now stood at a window, pleading with his people to relent. Stones and insults rained upon him, the voices of his subjects rising in contempt. He was struck down by those he once ruled, his dignity extinguished by the very people he had sought to protect. Marina translated no words that day. The scene spoke for itself. The king was broken, the gods defied, the city unchained. Thus the empire began to fracture, not in the clash of steel alone, but in the collapse of faith and authority. Cortés, Marina, and their followers now faced not a kingdom subdued, but a city in revolt. The delicate balance of captive kings and broken gods had given way to an inferno. The conquest had entered its most perilous hour, and Marina knew that the path ahead would demand more than words. It would demand blood, sacrifice, and a resilience deeper than any she had yet endured. The walls of Tenochtitlan closed in like a tightening fist. The massacre at the festival had turned awe into fury, reverence into rebellion. The Spaniards who once strode through the markets as curiosities now found themselves besieged, despised intruders hemmed in by the rage of an empire. The air grew heavy with smoke from burning barricades, with the cries of warriors echoing across canals. Supplies dwindled, water grew scarce, and the palace that had once seemed a sanctuary became a cage. Cortés, returning triumphant from his defeat of Narvaez, walked into a city that no longer trembled before him, but rose to expel him. For Marina, the transformation was devastating. Once her words had bridged worlds, softened edges, made diplomacy possible. Now they fell powerless into a sea of anger. No translation could undo the massacre. No phrase could restore trust. She still moved between Spaniards and Aztecs, carrying messages, but she sensed their futility. The empire had turned, and no voice, however eloquent, could command it back. Moctezuma's death had removed the last fragile barrier. Whether struck by Spanish hands or killed by stones from his own people, the result was the same. The emperor was gone, and with him the illusion of Spanish control. The city seethed with vengeance. Warriors massed on rooftops, hurled spears and stones, cut off the causeways. Canoes swarmed the waters, their paddles slapping like war drums. Every exit was watched, every street a trap. The Spaniards were surrounded, their allies faltering, their resolve stretched thin. Cortés faced the moment with grim determination. He had gambled everything, and now risked losing all. The choice was clear. They could not hold the city. They must flee. Yet to flee meant to abandon treasure, to confess weakness, to risk annihilation on the causeways. Still, there was no alternative. Under the cover of night, they prepared. Chests of gold, plundered from palaces and temples, were loaded onto the backs of men who could scarcely bear the weight. Some, obsessed with wealth, crammed their armor with golden trinkets, choosing greed over survival. The horses were readied, the soldiers armed, the allies gathered. Marina moved among them, silent, her face set. She knew this night would mark them all, that survival itself would be a victory. As darkness cloaked the city, the column began to move. Rain fell, cold and relentless, masking their footsteps but not their fear. They crept through narrow streets, slipping past watchful eyes, heading for the causeway that stretched across the lake. For a brief moment it seemed possible, as though they might slip away unseen, ghosts retreating into the night. But ghosts cannot escape the wrath of the living. The alarm was raised and suddenly the night exploded with sound. War cries pierced the rain. Drums thundered, horns blared. From every rooftop, every canal, the Aztecs struck. Chaos engulfed the Spaniards. Arrows rained from above, spears jabbed from canoes, stones crashed into helmets. Warriors poured into the causeway, blocking escape, forcing desperate combat on narrow ground slick with rain. Horses slipped. Men fell into the lake, dragged down by the weight of gold they refused to abandon. The chests of treasure became anchors, pulling greedy soldiers to their deaths, their hands still clutching useless wealth as the waters closed over them. Screams filled the night, mingling with the relentless beat of rain. Cortés fought like a man possessed, rallying his men, carving paths through the press of warriors. Yet even he could not command order in the storm. Around him, men died in heaps, their blood mingling with the rain, their bodies tumbling into the dark waters. Marina, shielded by the chaos, clung to survival. She saw allies cut down, Spaniards drowning, the causeway itself slick with corpses. She had no sword, no armor, no power to command, only the will to endure, the same will that had carried her from slavery to this night of terror. The column broke, scattering, fighting desperately toward the far shore. Horses reared, trampling allies and enemies alike. Cannons, dragged so laboriously into the city, were abandoned, sinking into the lake. Gold, once the lure of conquest, became the shroud of greed, dragging men to watery graves. The Spaniards, who had dreamed of empire, now thought only of escape. Their cries of agony, their prayers, their curses against the storm of arrows filled the night. It was a retreat drenched in humiliation, soaked in blood. When at last they staggered beyond the reach of the city, when dawn broke gray and merciless, the survivors gathered to count their losses. Hundreds lay dead, drowned, slain, vanished into the waters. Horses, cannons, treasure, all gone. The once proud army of Cortés was reduced to a broken remnant, shivering, wounded, bereft. Cortés himself wept beneath a great tree, his face buried in his hands, mourning not only the dead, but the shattering of his dream. It was a moment of despair so profound that even his men, hardened and cynical, felt its weight. The conqueror of empires had been humbled, and the night would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. Yet amid the ruin, Marina endured. She had not drowned, had not fallen beneath blades, had not vanished into the chaos. She walked among the survivors, tending wounds, offering words of resolve, her presence steady where all else had collapsed. To some she was a reminder of betrayal, the native woman who had guided Spaniards into the heart of Mexico. To others, she was the reason they yet lived, the bridge that still connected them to allies beyond the valley. To herself, she was something more complex, a survivor, once again torn from certainty, once again cast into uncertainty, yet still breathing, still vital. In the days that followed, the survivors limped toward Tlaxcala, pursued, harried, reduced to desperation. Many believed the conquest finished, the dream shattered, the empire secure once more in its might. But history rarely ends in a single night. Cortés, though broken, still carried within him the fire of ambition, and Marina, by his side, carried the voice that would yet rebuild alliances, forge new paths, and return them to the city they had fled. The night of sorrows was not the end, but a baptism of suffering, a crucible from which conquest would emerge more ruthless, more relentless, more inevitable. And for Marina, it was another transformation. She had walked through fire and rain, through betrayal and slaughter, and emerged with the same quiet resilience that had defined her since childhood. She was bound ever tighter to Cortés, not by love or loyalty alone, but by the shared knowledge that they had looked into the abyss and survived. The empire had struck with all its fury, and still they lived. That survival would shape what came next, for survival has its own momentum, its own inevitability. As the broken column disappeared into the valleys beyond the lake, Tenochtitlan stood triumphant, its warriors exultant, its gods avenged for a night. Yet in that triumph lay the seeds of tragedy still to come. Disease crept among the people, alliances shifted in the shadows, and the Spaniards, though beaten, were not destroyed. Marina knew this with a clarity that cut deeper than despair. The night had been sorrow, yes, but sorrow was not the end. It was only the beginning of a darker, more ruthless chapter. The Spaniards who stumbled into Tlaxcala were scarcely the army that had marched into Tenochtitlan with banners flying and drums pounding. They were broken men, limping on bloodied feet, gaunt with hunger, eyes hollow from sleepless nights of pursuit. Horses were few, weapons battered, pride stripped bare. The once fearsome conquistadors had been reduced to refugees clinging to survival. Yet Tlaxcala, remembering promises of alliance and the chance to shatter the Aztec grip, did not abandon them. Instead, the Tlaxcalans opened their arms, binding wounds, offering food, reaffirming a bond forged in desperation and hatred of the Mexica. For Cortés, it was proof that destiny still clung to him. He had faced annihilation and lived. He had lost gold, men, and dignity, but not the will to conquer. In Tlaxcala's aid, he saw the foundation for resurgence. His enemies believed him finished, yet he knew empires were not destroyed in a single night. He would rebuild, he would return, and he would bring Tenochtitlan to its knees. Marina, ever at his side, understood this resolve, though her heart carried the weight of the horrors they had endured. She moved among allies, translating promises, persuading chiefs, reminding them of Aztec cruelty. Her words rebuilt what steel alone could not. Even as Cortés plotted resurgence, fate offered him an unlooked-for ally. Disease, smallpox, carried by the Spaniards, spread through the valley like a fire through dry grass. Entire households withered in days, warriors fell before ever reaching the battlefield. Priests died before the altars of their gods. For the Mexica, it was an invisible terror, striking without spear or arrow. For Cortés, it was the unseen weapon that weakened an empire more than any army could. Marina, watching the devastation, felt the cruel irony. Her people, already torn by war, were now ravaged by a plague they could not fight. She had grown up in a world defined by ritual sacrifice, but now sacrifice came unbidden, demanded by an enemy unseen. With Tlaxcalan warriors swelling his ranks and disease softening resistance, Cortés began to rebuild. New weapons were forged, alliances expanded, and plans laid for a campaign unlike any before. He knew Tenochtitlan could not be taken by a single assault. It must be strangled, cut off, starved into submission. And so, with relentless determination, he ordered the construction of brigantines, small warships to dominate the lake. Timber was dragged from the highlands, planks shaped, sails sewn. It was an audacious vision, to bring naval war to the waters of Tenochtitlan. Marina's role grew ever more central. She negotiated with allied tribes, urging their loyalty, soothing their doubts, reinforcing Cortés's vision. She spoke of liberation from Aztec tribute, of freedom from sacrifice, of a new order that would favor those who joined now. She translated not only his words, but his aura of inevitability, transforming ambition into persuasion. Among the allies, she was seen as the embodiment of two worlds, a woman who could speak for both, who had endured captivity and risen to power. Her presence gave weight to Cortés's promises, her voice carried conviction across languages and cultures. The campaign began with fire and hunger. Cortés's forces swept through the valley, subduing towns still loyal to the Mexica. Cutting off supplies, severing lines of tribute, canoes clashed on the lake, brigantines cutting paths through fleets of defenders. Causeways were seized and lost, rebuilt and broken. Each day bled into the next, each skirmish another turn of the vice tightening around the city. Inside Tenochtitlan, famine took hold. The markets emptied, the canals grew foul, the temples echoed with cries to gods who no longer answered. Disease lingered, hunger gnawed, and yet the defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Marina walked among the conquered towns, hearing the pleas of those who begged for mercy, carrying Cortés's decrees of surrender. At times she softened the demands, tempering threats into bargains. At times she hardened them, knowing that leniency would only invite defiance. She lived with the knowledge that her words could condemn thousands or spare them. Each decision was a burden she carried quietly, another stone in the invisible weight upon her shoulders. As the siege dragged on, the city itself became a vision of apocalypse. Smoke hung over the lake, the once proud temples scarred by cannon fire, the causeways littered with corpses. Canoes sank beneath the weight of battle, their occupants swallowed by the dark waters. Streets became killing grounds, plazas turned to fields of ash. The grandeur that had awed the Spaniards upon their arrival was reduced to rubble and hunger. Yet still the Mexica fought, their spirit unbroken even as their bodies failed. Cortés pressed on, relentless, his will sharpened by humiliation. He would not be remembered for the night of sorrows, he would be remembered for triumph. His men, hardened by loss, fought with the desperation of those who had nothing left but victory or death. The Tlaxcalans, eager for revenge, hurled themselves into the fray with merciless zeal. Together they pushed deeper into the city, block by block, temple by temple, until at last the defenders could resist no longer. Marina stood beside Cortés as envoys came to plead for peace. She translated their words, their exhaustion, their grief. She knew the city was finished, knew that resistance had only prolonged suffering, and yet even in defeat, the Mexica carried themselves with dignity. They fought not for conquest, but for the preservation of a world that was vanishing before their eyes. Marina felt the tragedy of it with piercing clarity. She had been the voice of destruction, but also the witness to the courage of a people who refused to bow until they had no strength left. When at last Tenochtitlan fell in August of 1521, it was not with a single stroke, but with a slow, agonizing collapse. The temples burned, the palaces crumbled, the canals ran red. Cortés entered the ruins not as a guest or hostage, but as master, his ambition fulfilled. Yet the city he had conquered was no longer the jewel he had first beheld. It was a skeleton of ash and ruin. He had won an empire, but what he inherited was devastation. For Marina, the fall was both victory and wound. She had survived, she had shaped events, she had stood at the center of history's turning. Yet she knew the cost. Her words had opened doors that led to ruin. Her translations had carried demands that destroyed a world. She had no illusions of innocence, no refuge in denial. And yet she also understood that she, too, had been carried along by forces larger than herself. Ambition, empire, fate. She was not simply betrayer or victim, but both and more. A woman who had endured, who had transformed survival into influence, who had shaped conquest as much as she had been shaped by it. As Cortés surveyed the smoldering ruins of Tenochtitlan, dreaming of New Spain, Marina stood beside him, silent. In the silence lay the paradox of conquest, that an empire had been undone not only by steel and gunpowder, not only by disease and famine, but by words, by the quiet persistence of a voice that bridged worlds. She had been the channel of destruction, but also the mother of something new. From ashes and blood, a different Mexico would be born. Mestizo, fractured, resilient. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. For Cortés, it was triumph. For Marina, it was survival, burden, and legacy. As the smoke drifted over the lake, as the echoes of battle faded, she knew the world she had known was gone forever. Ahead lay new struggles, marriage, motherhood, erasure. But for now she stood amid the ruins, the silent witness to the death of an empire and the birth of something no one could yet name. The smoke still lingered over the valley when the Spaniards began to remake the ruins of Tenochtitlan into something new. Cortés walked among toppled temples and broken palaces with the air of a man surveying property rather than tragedy. To him, the destruction was not an end, but a foundation, a canvas upon which he would paint a new world. He envisioned a Spanish city rising from the ashes, a capital not of Aztec emperors, but of New Spain, where banners of Castile and crosses of Christ would stand where once gods of stone had demanded blood. Yet for all his triumph, Cortés knew he was a precarious victor. The conquest had been achieved not by Spaniards alone, but by a fragile alliance of native peoples. Above all, the Tlaxcalans, who demanded recognition and reward. Disease still ravaged the land, famine still gnawed at survivors, and rebellion simmered in the shadows. Cortés carried the crown of conquest, but it was heavy with doubt. He needed to solidify his rule, not only with steel, but with legitimacy. In this new order, Marina's presence was both visible and invisible. She remained at his side in negotiations with allies, in councils where chiefs demanded concessions, in moments where Spanish ambition met native grievance. She continued to translate not merely words but intent, soothing tensions, explaining complexities, offering a human bridge across cultures. Yet outside these chambers, among the people of the city, her name grew poison. To them she was not Doña Marina, but La Malinche, the woman who had spoken their defeat into existence. Children whispered her name as accusation, elders invoked it as curse. She bore this weight in silence, knowing that survival had demanded choices that history would never forgive. Within the intimate circle of Cortés's household, her role shifted again. She had given birth to Martín, the son of Cortés, one of the first mestizo children of the New World. The child was proof of collision, the living embodiment of conquest paradox, part Spanish, part indigenous, born of war and alliance, of intimacy and necessity. Cortés acknowledged him, cradled him, spoke of him as a bridge between worlds. Yet in the eyes of many Spaniards, Martín was a curiosity, neither wholly theirs nor wholly native, a reminder that the boundaries of blood had already begun to blur. For Marina, motherhood was a transformation deeper than baptism, deeper than conquest. She had been a discarded child, a captive, a survivor. Now she was a mother, her body no longer only a vessel of translation, but of lineage. She held Martín close, whispering lullabies in a mix of Nahuatl and Spanish, weaving a new language for a new generation. In him she saw both hope and burden, hope that he might grow in a world not defined by chains, burden that he would carry the legacy of a conquest that would shape him long after her own voice was silenced. Cortés' ambitions stretched beyond the valley. He dispatched expeditions across Mexico, seeking gold, allies, and dominion. He sent ships to the coasts, messengers to the crown, reports heavy with justification and glory. He sought to present himself not as rebel or rogue, but as loyal servant of Spain, the man who had given the empire a new jewel. Yet the crown's suspicion grew, wary of any conquistador whose power seemed too independent, too great. Cortés had seized an empire, but in doing so, he had alarmed his own monarchs. Amid these shifting currents of politics, Marina's own fate began to change. For all her indispensability, she was not a Spaniard. Her role as interpreter and companion, once vital, was now overshadowed by the presence of new Spanish wives and noblewomen arriving to cement society. Cortés himself, though he had acknowledged her son, arranged a marriage for Marina to one of his trusted lieutenants, Juan Jaramillo. It was an act that spoke of both gratitude and dismissal. She would be provided for, given status, yet placed aside from the intimate circle of his power. To Marina, this transition was both familiar and painful. Once again, she was given from one man to another. Once again, her fate shaped by forces beyond her choice. Yet she accepted it with the same resilience that had marked her life. She had survived abandonment, slavery, war, and conquest. She would survive this too. She moved into marriage with quiet dignity, raising Martín and later another child, navigating the strange terrain of being both central to history and erased from its records. In Spanish chronicles, her presence began to fade. Writers praised Cortés' brilliance, his daring, his cunning. They spoke of Tlaxcalan warriors, of battles won and lost, of ships built and cities burned. Marina appeared only as a shadow, a translator, a woman whose name was seldom honored. Yet among the native people, her memory remained searing, sharper than any sword. She was invoked as the betrayer who had stood beside the conqueror, the woman who had spoken doom. In this dual erasure, ignored by Spaniards, reviled by her own, Marina became less a person than a symbol, her humanity drowned by legend. Yet within her, the truth persisted. She was no simple betrayer, no passive accomplice. She had been a girl denied choice, a woman who had navigated survival with intelligence and grace, who had wielded words as weapons when steel failed. She had been the axis upon which conquest turned, the voice through which an empire fell and another rose. Her influence, though silenced in chronicles, lived on in every mestizo child, in every fusion of language and culture, in every prayer whispered in Spanish laced with Nahuatl. Cortés, now governor of New Spain, stood at the pinnacle of glory, yet haunted by shadows. His enemies plotted in Spain, his rivals whispered in Mexico, his own men grumbled over rewards denied. He had won an empire, but holding it was a war of its own. And within his household, the presence of Martín, the child of Marina, reminded him daily of the blurred lines between conqueror and conquered. He could never erase the woman who had made his triumph possible, nor the bond that bound them in history. Marina, walking through markets rebuilt atop ruins, carrying her child, knew that her world had been remade beyond recognition. The temples were gone, the gods silenced, the city renamed Mexico City. Spanish churches rose where pyramids had stood, markets bustled with a new mix of goods and languages, crosses overshadowed the old idols. She was at once a part of this new world, and apart from it, both mother and exile, both central and forgotten. Her story in this chapter of history ended not with grand pronouncements, but with quiet persistence. She lived, she bore children, she adapted, she endured, and in that endurance lay her greatest legacy. For though Cortés claimed glory, though Spain claimed empire, it was Marina who embodied the true reality of conquest, survival amid destruction, transformation amid loss, the birth of a new identity from the ruins of the old. As the sun set over the valley, casting light across the lake where once Tenochtitlan had gleamed, Marina walked with her child in her arms, her gaze steady, her heart carrying both sorrow and resilience. She knew she would not be remembered kindly. She knew her name would become a curse, her face a shadow. But she also knew that memory is not the same as truth. And the truth was that she had endured where others had perished, had spoken where silence would have killed, had lived to see the dawn of a new world. For in the end, empire was not only measured in gold or banners, but in families, in children, in the blending of blood and language that would shape generations. Marina, the discarded child, the captive woman, the indispensable translator, was now the mother of a lineage that would carry forward the paradox of conquest. She had given her people both wound and future, and in her quiet resilience, she had become something greater than betrayal or loyalty. She had become history itself, walking, breathing, enduring. The years that followed the fall of Tenochtitlan were not years of peace but of transformation, years in which the ruins of empire hardened into the foundations of New Spain. Cortés oversaw the construction of churches where temples had stood, plazas where blood had once run, palaces where nobles had been slain. The city was renamed Mexico City, the jewel of Spain's overseas empire. But beneath its stones, the memory of Tenochtitlan remained, whispering through canals, buried in the rubble of pyramids, lingering in the grief of a people who had seen their gods silenced. For Cortés, these years were filled with both triumph and unease. He was hailed as the conqueror of Mexico, the man who had given Spain a new empire, yet his relationship with the crown grew strained. His power was too great, his independence too dangerous. The monarchs of Spain, grateful for his victories yet wary of his ambition, slowly stripped him of authority. He was granted titles, lands, riches, yet watched as his role diminished. He had seized an empire with 600 men, but he could not secure the loyalty of a court oceans away. Marina lived these years in quieter shadows. She had been given in marriage to Juan Jaramillo, a soldier of Cortés, as though her role in the great drama of conquest had ended. She bore another child, raising him alongside Martín, the son she had given Cortés. She managed a household, spoke less in public, her presence fading from the chronicles that once could not proceed without her. Yet even in this fading, she remained central in ways unseen. In her children, in the blending of blood and lineage, she embodied the future of a nation not yet born. Her death came early, perhaps in her 20s, perhaps in her 30s. The records are sparse, her passing marked not with grandeur, but with silence. No chronicler lingered on her final days. No monument rose in her memory. She disappeared into obscurity, her name carried forward not by Spaniards who sought to erase her, and not by her own people who reviled her, but by the generations who would later resurrect her as symbol and paradox. La Malinche, betrayer, mother, victim, survivor, became less a person than an echo, a figure invoked in curses, in debates, in the stories parents told their children about treachery and survival. Cortés, by contrast, lived long enough to taste the bitterness of decline. He returned to Spain, seeking recognition, craving the honors he believed he deserved. He petitioned, argued, defended his deeds before kings and councils. He was granted titles, yes, but not the power he hungered for. He grew restless, isolated, disillusioned. The man who had once commanded empires now wandered court corridors as a petitioner, ignored, resented, half forgotten. He died in 1547, his body buried, moved, forgotten, rediscovered, a conqueror denied even the stability of a final resting place. His end was not triumph but irony. The man who had seized immortality through conquest slipped into obscurity in the land he had sought to glorify. Together, their legacies form a contradiction too sharp to resolve. Cortés is remembered as the destroyer of the Aztec Empire, the conquistador who remade a continent. Yet his glory is stained with brutality, greed, and betrayal, his name both revered and despised. Marina is remembered as the interpreter who gave him voice, the woman who stood at his side, the mother of his child. To Spaniards, she was a footnote. To her people, a traitor. To later generations, a paradox. She was neither fully victim nor fully agent, but something far more complex. A survivor who endured the impossible and shaped history through the fragile weapon of words. The Mexico that emerged was not wholly Spanish nor wholly indigenous. It was something new, born of conquest and survival, of gold and blood, of prayers whispered to Christ and tears shed for gods long silenced. It was mestizo, a fusion of bloodlines and cultures, a nation carried forward not only by conquerors but by women like Marina, whose bodies and voices bore the burden of transformation. In the centuries that followed, her name became legend and accusation. To call someone a Malinchista in Mexico became to call them a betrayer, one who prefers the foreigner over their own. Her image was twisted into a symbol of treachery, of surrender. Yet others reclaimed her, seeing not betrayal but resilience, not treachery but survival. Feminists later saw in her the cruel fate of women in conquest, taken, used, silenced, yet indispensable. Historians saw in her the birth of a new identity, the first mother of a mestizo nation. She is remembered less for what she truly was and more for what she represents, A woman forced into the currents of history, stripped of choice yet wielding influence, condemned as traitor yet essential to survival. Her paradox remains unsolved, a mirror held up to the complexity of conquest itself. Picture, then, the closing image of this story. Not Cortés in armor, not Moctezuma on his throne, not the city in flames, but Marina, walking quietly with her child on a dusty street of the New Mexico City. Around her, churches rise where temples once stood. Spanish merchants shout in markets where Nahuatl once ruled. Crosses gleam where idols were toppled. She moves unseen, carrying both past and future in her arms. She knows her name will not be sung in glory, that her story will be told in whispers and accusations. Yet she walks on, a mother, a survivor, the forgotten architect of an empire. And as centuries unfold, as nations rise and fall, her figure lingers, not as saint, not as villain, but as paradox. Was she the destroyer of her people, or the first to imagine a new one? Was she traitor, or the mother of a nation? The truth lies in the silence between those words, a silence she carried all her life, a silence that still echoes in the story of Mexico. This is how her story ends. Not with triumph, not with vindication, but with a question that refuses to die.